Good afternoon, everybody, and for those of you who are not part of the Urban Big Data Centre, welcome, and hope you're enjoying today. I thoroughly enjoyed Alan's talk this morning, and there are certainly some connections, I think, with our talk. This is work that's yet to be done. This is work that we're planning. So we thought, as part of the Big Data kind of launch workshop, that we would just give you a taster of some of the work that we're hoping to do. The team is made up of myself, Geoff Meen, who's going to come and speak in a moment, Bernie Fingleton from Cambridge, and Richard Harris from Bristol, and Wenji Wu here from Glasgow. So this project is an attempt to build an integrated, multi-sectoral model of employment and migration. Why might we be interested in migration? Well, I think, first of all, just the scale of the increase, the exponential increase that we've seen in international migration, and the likely continued increase in international migration tells us that this is something that, just the magnitude of it is something that is likely to be an issue for us and a concern and a benefit to society into the future. In terms of the benefits, of course, this level of migration of labour says something potentially about increased efficiency, mobility of labour, the potential growth prospects for economies. But I guess also it raises lots of challenges at the urban level, because that level of migration, which may increase in future due to climate migration, whole countries perhaps becoming unsustainable due to changes in the climate, etc., that raises all sorts of issues. It raises housing issues, that's the obvious one. What are the pressures on house prices and housing supply? It raises social cohesion issues. People from very different backgrounds, different religions, different beliefs, different social class, different language, coming together, often, almost always really, in an urban environment. Actually, part of the challenge in some countries is the migration from rural to urban. And also the employment challenges, because migrants are often drawn to centres of employment, and that raises tensions, I guess, historically, with the local indigenous workforce. Migrants, do they take jobs or do they create them? So there's a load of really interesting, exciting questions from a social science point of view that connect very powerfully with some of the debates going on in politics. And we're hoping to provide, I guess, an evidence base, some rigour to some of those debates. So here are some specific research questions that we're hoping to pursue. First of all, what actually attracts and repels migrants? Now, we know that qualitatively. We know there's lots of literatures on that. But actually, do we have really robust estimates that show what type of migrants are attracted to what sorts of areas, how that might vary between different groups, how that might vary across different types of cities, etc.? We're also interested in spatial persistence. Some migrant groups seem to locate in an area and remain there for generations. Others seem to disperse very quickly. What are the factors that drive that? I think that's a really interesting and politically sensitive question. And is immigration good for urban economies? We know from macroeconomic studies that there is apparent economic growth and employment generation that comes from attracting migrants, but how does that play out on a local level? What's the spatial aspect to that? And there's a whole range of other impacts that we're interested in, such as the impact on house prices, on market fragmentation and dynamics, segregation issues, how that's revealed in the housing market through search behaviour and estate agent behaviour, and even how it interacts with crime patterns and issues of city structures. Our work is going to be based on some very exciting work that's been done by Geoff Meen and colleagues. So I'm going to ask Geoff now just to come and tell us a little bit about the antecedents of this research, and then I'll come back and tell you where we plan to go from there.
Good afternoon, everyone. My badge tells me that I'm an economist. And that is inevitably influenced the sort of way I've actually sort of approached these questions. But one of the sort of great advantages, I think, of this centre is it's going to allow me to work in lots of interdisciplinary fields. So working with geographers and computer scientists and all of these different fields, something which should be really interesting. But the sort of the methods and the sort of projects which I'm going to talk about for the moment, for a few moments, really are reflecting the methods which applied economists typically would use. So not necessarily the same ones which geographers would use. Now, the first message which I think I would draw from work which has been going on for really quite a long period of time now at Reading, looking at migration patterns, is that we wish we'd had a big data centre many years ago. Because the real problem of actually trying to do this sort of work is the fact we have to construct most of the data ourselves. And it's not good enough for many purposes just to use census data or whatever it might be. Now, really, if we're going to study urban phenomena, in particular migration, we need two things, or two types of data. We need very local data, ideally individual-based data with the addresses of where everyone actually lives. Okay? Usual administrative data which we're forced to deal with are not good enough for most purposes. Yes, we often have to deal with these things, but we have to be aware of the shortcomings associated with them. Secondly, we have to use, or we would ideally like to have, very long-run historical data. And one of the reasons for this is essentially that we're dealing with urban systems and migration, that change doesn't actually happen very often. What we actually tend to observe are patterns or spatial patterns which are very spatially persistent, but they change very quickly on an irregular basis. And therefore, we have very short data sets. We're actually not going to pick up what we're actually particularly interested in. Now, there are three branches, at least of the economics literature, which are particularly valuable for trying to model migration patterns. The first one comes from standard neoclassical location theories, which still dominate most of the economic literature. Not going to run down location theories or whatever, but for our purposes, one of the problems of these things is that they're not very good in terms of analysing the dynamics of change, which is one thing which I think we're particularly interested in if we're looking at urban systems. The second types of models which we can use are social interactions models, models of self-organisations, and models of complexity and all these things, which are incredibly useful for looking at urban systems. But I think I would argue that they've been underutilised in terms of looking at patterns of migration within urban systems. So there's quite a lot to be done in that particular area. And the third branch of the literature, which I think is very important and very useful, is essentially institutional historical analysis. And there's some really, really very exciting work using quantitative methods applied to historical data, which is appearing in the literature recently, but has yet not been applied hardly at all to migration work and to work on housing markets. So there's a lot that economists can actually learn from that branch of the literature. Now, part of our work is really trying to bring together some of these disparate aspects in terms of both the data and to theory, and are particularly applied to problems of migration. That's essentially what we're trying to do. Now, sometimes we think that migration's a new problem. It's not. Edward I expelled all Jewish, I think most if not all of Jewish population from England in the 12th, 13th century, whatever it was. So that was perhaps one of the earliest examples of these things. In London in the 18th century, there were riots over Irish immigrants. In the 19th century, both the House of Commons and the House of Lords had committees of inquiries into migrants, one form or another. And of course, very recently, we've had a House of Lords commission or inquiry onto migration as well. And in all these cases, it generally tends to be the same issues which are of particular interest. And they tend to be the effects on wages of the working classes and also on rents and house prices and these sorts of things. Okay, it's probably expanded a little bit nowadays in terms of implications for social services and so on and so forth. But by and large, these same sets of issues come over and over again across the different centuries. And it's still probably fair to say that until very recently, the amount of research which has actually been done on these factors has been very limited. It's changed quite a lot actually in the last few years. Again, looking at wage effects, employment effects and all of these sorts of things. But I think I would argue that most of the interesting work which is going on at the moment in migration essentially doesn't address one of the key features of migration, and that is that it is essentially an urban phenomenon. It tends to look at in an aspatial framework, the sort of macroeconomic consequences of these things. Whereas we know throughout the centuries, migration concentrations have been very urban concentrated, particularly London, but not exclusively. So therefore, essentially, we have to have a research agenda which is looking at the questions of why migrants live in particular locations, what are the effects of those migrants on those urban environments, and so on and so forth. Now, the work which I'm talking about really comes from 4 studies which are down there on the slide there. I won't go sort of through those. But basically what they're really trying to do is to look at the factors which determine migration patterns, and also what has been the effect of policy variables over the course of long periods of time, both on housing markets, on migration. Now, the first sort of set of data which people don't tend to look at as being particularly important is actually geological data. And this is something we're starting to look at. But we've actually done some work on Melbourne already. Melbourne is one of my favourite case study areas. I think there's some Australian speakers next. Melbourne's wonderful as a case study simply because it's almost completely documented properly since the beginning of European settlement in the 1830s. So we can do wonderful things with those things. Now, what this particular map actually shows is essentially the relationship between local house prices in Melbourne and the underlying geological structure. And essentially, where you've got big circles, that's the areas where house prices are the highest, and small circles is essentially where they are the lowest. And essentially, the background are different types of rock formations in there. Now, when Melbourne was first established in the 1830s, not surprisingly, the central business district was established on basically fertile soils at that particular time, because it was still primarily agricultural at that particular time. And the central business district is essentially around that area there. That's Phillip Bay, that's water down there. Okay. So, of course, soil fertility is not terribly important these days to the sort of the activities of the urban population in Melbourne these days. But if we look out here, these areas here are essentially, the red colours, are essentially volcanic rock. So they were very infertile at the time when these things were actually important. And most of, in fact, at that time, almost no one actually lived there. And the urban developments out in those sorts of western areas of Melbourne have only just very recently started to take place. They were traditionally very much an industrial area. Now, the point being that if we look at the relationship between geology and house prices today, we can still explain something around about 25% of the price distribution in terms of those underlying rock formation, okay? Including actually distance from the central business district as well. So one first message is essentially structures of urban systems are very, very highly persistent. It's not saying that there's a sort of a geological determinism in this, but they are still very important, and work is going on for Britain at that moment. Now, second thing which we really need to know is essentially where people move to and from. And we can do that actually at four small spatial scales for London and most other cities. It's actually possible to trace in quite a lot of details, for example, most areas of London from the periods of Roman settlement right up to the current time. We know pretty well what actually went on in those areas. And there is work going on with RMIT in Melbourne on these things, or actually to try to look at population flows over long periods of time and changes in the nature of the environment at that time. And one of the things which we can do for Melbourne is essentially to look using electoral register data about population flows for people who started out in 1949 in the sort of central areas and where they actually moved over the course of time. So it's perfectly possible using electoral register data, various other forms, to trace for Melbourne and most other Australian cities exactly where people went over long periods of time. And we can do this constructing longitudinal panel data sets from 1903 right up to the current time. So it is therefore possible to have data with addresses and lots of other characteristics we want over long periods of time. So the question is, actually, can we actually do this for the United Kingdom? Australia is better than the UK, but we can actually do something similar. First of all, it's possible to extract from census records where people actually moved from the mid-1850s right up to 1911 now. All of that information has been digitised. Unfortunately, it's not actually in the form which we actually need to use for empirical analysis. There's still a lot of work to be done on those things. And that can actually be linked into things like post office records and electoral register data. So it is perfectly possible to construct long-run panel data sets right from the 19th century, mid-19th century, following generations of individuals right more or less up to the current time. And essentially, that's what we've been doing for some time. Now, I would argue that big data is not just about millions and millions of observations and particular ways of sort of coding all this information. It's also about trying to include difficult data sets, which is difficult to put together, and putting in a form which is publicly available. And essentially that's the sort of process which we're going on for this, not only in terms of migrants, but also for populations as a whole for different cities. So we can actually trace over different generations, over long periods of time, where people actually move from. One of the things which we can do for London and probably other places is actually to look at policy variables. This is an example of slum clearance programs in London since about 1890, I think it was. And essentially what it does, it plots every single slum clearance program by individual property and coded up into these maps over that course of time. So we know exactly what the changes in the environment in terms of slum clearance program have actually been over the course of time. But again, it takes an awful lot of effort to put these data sets together. And these and other policy type variables are factors which are actually influential, or one of the things which we can take into account by looking at migration flows as well as domestic migration flows as well. And essentially that's what we're trying to do. But, as I say, what a large part of our work is about at the moment is trying to model migration flows. And at the moment, that's not possible to do that on the basis of individuals, although we're working towards that. What we do have, however, which seems to be an underexploited source, is essentially country of birth flows for all migrants from 1851 right up to the current census. Again, it's not in a nice, usable form, partly because the spatial locations change. And this can be done from the 19th century registration districts right up to local authority sorts of levels now. So it is perfectly possible to do that. Why would we want to do it? Well, the reason is, back to a point that I made at the start, that essentially patterns of migrants are actually very spatially persistent. But it varies according to the types of migrants. And this is just a sort of brief summary of some of the key findings. Persistence in migrant structures is extremely strong since the 19th century. We can explain pretty well spatial distribution of migrants right up to the Second World War on what those patterns were in the mid-19th century. Didn't change very much. However, those, of course, they do change when there are big, what we might call exogenous shocks to the system. And obviously the Second World War was a big shock to the system. And that did actually have a big effect upon the distribution of migrant flows within London according to different parts of the city. So, for example, there was a strong Polish contingent of migrants in the East End of London, which essentially had been there since the mid-19th century. And that community almost disappeared overnight in the Second World War, broke down suddenly. But those patterns get re-established after the Second World War in different locations. So there is a very strong pattern of persistence and agglomeration from these particular groups. But it differs according to different types of migrants. If you're talking about migrants from countries which are low income, you're much more likely to observe continuing patterns of concentration than migrants that come from countries which are actually high income. And that's arguably a sort of a network type issue that we don't need to require on these networks quite so much. It's also true that migrants coming from countries which are not heavily represented already in London tend to be more spatially dispersed than those which are already heavily concentrated in London. And essentially, these are perfectly consistent with types of models which emphasise social interactions, networks, complex systems, and all of these sorts of phenomena. They can be, however, disturbed by large shocks, such as things like the Second World War. But it doesn't happen very often on these things.
About 5 years.
That's fine. Perfectly okay. Was it? Right, okay. Right. Yeah. Just to finish and hand over to Gwilym. We now have a pretty good idea, at least using census data, about what are the key factors which affect migrant distributions. In fact, things like employment opportunities, house prices, housing costs, they have an effect, but they're not terribly dramatic. They're much less important than the existing distributions of these things. What we now need to move on to, however, is what actually are the implications of those patterns for other variables, things like house prices and employment opportunities and all those. And I think that's what Gwilym's going to talk about.
Thank you, Geoff. So taking this exciting long-term project that Geoff's been working with on explaining what attracts migrants to areas and their spatial persistence, we hope to, in this project, apply that to a range of cities, not just small areas of London, for example, but also we hope to extend it. And in two ways. One is we want to extend the kind of core in-depth modelling bit. Our project isn't that long, really, in academic terms, only 18 months. But in addition to that, we also want to connect, at least in an exploratory way, with a range of other exciting variables that the big data centre is going to bring together. So first of all, perhaps one of the key things we would like to do is to say, well, that employment variable that is used as an attractor in these models, that's exogenous in economic terms, or is determined outside of the system, is employment at the local level affected in some way in migration? That sounds like a simple thing to do, but actually by making employment endogenous, you then enter the world of simultaneous dynamic panel spatial modelling. And one of the key people on our team is Bernie Fingleton, and that's one of his areas of interest. That's one of the things that we hope to advance the literature in our project. Another aspect of our project is to make use of another element of the Big Data Centre, which is trying to build a digital terrain model of the city of Glasgow. Now, that's not new, but what is, I think, new is that we hope to go back in time and to create this digital terrain model year on year, going back 10 years, so to show how the city of Glasgow, the physical shape of the city, has changed. And the person who's leading on that is Zen Hong, who's an expert in using radar data, satellite data, to create these surfaces of the urban environment. So we plan to look at whether changes to the urban environment in Glasgow have had an effect on these migrant and employment patterns. That might be an important. Those kind of physical changes might be important, and in future research it could be something that could be rolled out for other cities. As Geoff said, we're interested in impact on house price. That's another variable that we could make endogenous to make this system even more realistic, but also more complex. And it connects with some other projects that we're doing on the sorting processes of housing markets. Our housing markets themselves have a role in allocating people across the urban environment, in creating segregation, or specialised neighbourhoods, as Paul Cheshire calls them. We also potentially could link our research to exciting crime data. Here we have Glasgow, this data that not only tells you where crimes have been committed, but it tells you where the location of the offender, where the offender lives. So you have crime commuting patterns, if you like, where the criminal goes to do his daily job. Now, what would be interesting is to see how those crime commuting patterns map on to patterns of ethnicity and changes to those patterns of ethnicity. Are the crimes occurring within particular communities coming largely from outside of those communities, and how does that change in the light of these patterns of change that we've been talking about? And finally, what we're interested in is also the impact of migration and changing social structure of a city on the perceptions that people have of those ethnic communities and those neighbourhoods. So, for example, in other work I'm doing, I'm interested in how looking at estate agent data and how estate agents describe a particular dwelling and the neighbourhood, the hyperbole they use, how that can reveal something about perception. So this is actually a map of real estate hyperbole in Glasgow, where the dark areas are the peaks in hyperbole, if you like. But there's more nuanced quantitative text analysis that we could do to look at how market perceptions of these changing social structures are revealed. Markets, I believe, are really just social constructs. They reveal our preferences, our prejudices, what we really think in terms of where we like to live and the kind of neighbours we have. And some other work I've been doing looks at this idea of perceived substitutability of different neighbourhoods, and we could look at how those perceptions change. So I think, all in all, we are hoping to combine a mixture of in-depth spatial econometric modelling that has some spatial interaction effects with it, but also to do some exploratory work that will hopefully set the scene for other research into the future. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you quite a mean question now, I think. As we explore big data, the other things pop up like big privacy. And I just wondered what your thoughts were about, you can imagine some of these fantastic questions that we want to answer and ask. Big privacy starts to pop up as an issue as well, especially when we take it down to the person level, health record, insurance, all these other. What are your thoughts on how that might be an agent, a tension that we have to manage?
That's a great question, and I think I just came from a conference a couple of weeks ago, and that was one of the major themes in that conference: big data, big rubbish, and big privacy issues. I think Geoff and I are quite lucky in this project because we're not using any confidential data really. Most of what we're doing is using data that's publicly available. I think we're doing it, in quite creative ways. But some of this data that we're looking at is actually already out there. Census data, for example, obviously anybody can use that. Even some of the work we're doing, for example, that's using land registry data in Scotland, which has some fantastic properties, which I can talk at length about. But that data is publicly available. You could go along and you could actually look at individual records, and we're just exploiting that data. Now, other projects within the Big Data Centre may well address that issue, face that issue.
I was thinking like the social media, you can imagine some trending in there, dialects and language, there's all sorts of things you can start putting together. I'm not suggesting, as you say, this is overly relevant. It's more of a generic question.
I think my answer to that, at least from my research point of view, is that I'm not interested in individual people. And actually, my data isn't generally collected at that level. What I'm interested in is patterns and dynamics, if you like. So I don't think there's anything in here that's going to reveal anything about you, for example, as an individual, but it might reveal something about the way where you live has changed and how people perceive it has changed. But it's a great question, and there's a whole separate issue here about how we manage the ethics of confidential data, but in my particular project, I don't think that comes up, but it's still a good question.
Hi, that was very interesting. And just to sort of follow on from the question about privacy, one of the questions I got is, and we're interested in data and applying it and applying it to policy and managing change in the transport system, the sort of transport system we want. But the question I had, in looking at models and developing models and finding revealing information, what are the levers of change that you identify? How do you use models and findings from models to influence the new infrastructure and society and civilization that we wish to develop? How do we help shape those questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think as an academic, I've changed in terms of my goals. As a young researcher, I was just interested in the models. But now I'm increasingly wanting to work with, in partnership with people in policy or in the private sector, so that the models that we're developing, not necessarily the core high-tech bit of the model, but the application of it, the toolkit that could come out of it. And I guess my view is that we need to change as academics from having a model that says, here's a bit of research, now tell us what you want to do with it, you know, rather than actually involving people in that process. And I've been trying really hard to do that, not in this project because we haven't even started yet, but it's a good point to raise the question. But in other projects, it's actually really difficult to find policymakers with the time to work with us. But certainly it's an open invitation. If you think what we're doing here might be relevant, and we would like to work with you, just to know what questions would really interest you, because then we can often tweak these models in a way that would allow them to sort of simulate things that might be of relevance. Yeah.
Just to sort of extend on that.
Sorry, you need to go up to the microphone, please.
Apologies. Yes. Just to sort of extend on that is that yes, we've done a lot of work on working with policymakers over the years on different housing models, for example. It's rather different dealing with urban systems in many ways. That I think one of the things which we've already learned from the work which we've done so far is that essentially if you're dealing with urban drivers, they take a long time to have any effect. That they typically take lots longer than the particular time horizon of a policymaker. And trying to get that one over is not a terribly easy one always to convince a policymaker of.
There's no other questions. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can't help thinking UKIP in this context. I even have any data which you think will come out in time to influence the next general election. And another issue more seriously is issues are presumably very different at different scales as well. You're talking big cities, but presumably you're looking at some smaller cities as well, where influences can be very different over there.
I think I'll hand that one over to Geoff. I mean, my immediate response is that we already know from existing studies that migration can have a very positive effect on the local economy, on the macroeconomy. I guess what we're trying to do is understand that at a local level. Whether it will say anything about UKIP, I suspect UKIP won't want to know what our results are. But I think what we're hoping to see is that it's not just whether it's good or bad to have migration, but in what circumstances does it work best, and in what circumstances does it create the greatest growth and positive impacts. Any further thoughts, Geoff?
I mean, I think my obvious comment would be that if people are actually not interested in the results, then we think we failed fairly miserably on an issue which is so controversial as this. I mean, a colleague of mine working on local migration issues recently managed to make the front page or the full front page of the Mail on Sunday on a fairly uncontroversial set of results, which he'd been actually doing. I think we have to be very careful, of course, about the presentation of these things, essentially, that we wouldn't want to be sensationalist about this, but we will stand by our results. That's what it comes down to.
All right. If there are no more questions,